Before I begin with my story, I want to point out that this isn't the type of story to make you jump out of your seat. This is, however, a very real and traumatizing story for me. To preface this, I'm a female, currently 18 years old, and live on a ranch in a very secluded small town in rural Iowa. It mostly consists of multiple farms, lands, fields, etc. I've lived there my whole life and even met some of the people in my town who were very respectful, as it's a quiet little town. I won't mention the name of it as I don't want this getting out there, but it has a population of about 2,000 people. This happened during the summer of 2021 and is by far the most horrifying thing that's ever happened to me. For context, I work at a gun store in my town, which is very safe for the most part. However, I always bike to and from work as both my parents worked late nights in the city and couldn't get me until later in the night. Well, one day, my bike had been stolen by someone from the rack right outside of the shop when I wasn't paying attention. I was obviously pissed because of this and didn't bother contacting the sheriff as they really didn't care what happened around here. Most of the time, they wouldn't take thefts seriously and either half-assed investigated them or claimed that they didn't have enough evidence. With the police no longer being an option, I called my dad telling him the situation and he said he'd come by to get me after work. On the way home that day, he's giving me a lecture throughout the whole car ride about how I was careless. That night, I had been on my computer searching through Craigslist to see if I could find an affordable bike to buy. I didn't need a super expensive bike, just one that would get me from point A to point B. Within 20 minutes, I had found one that seemed like a steal. It was a standard bike that seemed to be in great condition and was only $70. The seller was only 15 miles away from the nearest city, so it was a long drive, but it would be worth it. My parents had been at work that night, and with no car, I had taken an Uber to the drop-off spot. When my ride had dropped me off, I noticed a black van parked on the side of the road with its lights turned off. It was the only vehicle in the area, so I could only assume that was him. I messaged the seller, asking if that was him in the van, to which he then said yes and to come over. I ever so slowly walk over towards the driver's side when I see a man roll down his window and introduced himself as Jeff. He had claimed that he was the one selling the bike and that it was in the back of the van. He then tells me I could go ahead and open the doors and just grab the bike. I then thought to myself as to why he wasn't doing it, and when I asked him this, he said that he had a bad knee and that it hurt to walk. Not wanting to pry and too tired to care, I proceeded to walk towards the back of the van where the bike was. As I'm about to open the doors, I can see very faintly from the window a man wearing a vendetta mask staring back at me. The second I noticed him, I instantly knew that this wasn't some exchange and there was definitely no bike. Not making it obvious I noticed him, I told the driver that I didn't need the bike anymore and that he could go. However, I was afraid if he had known I had seen someone else back there and tried my best to stay calm. I start running towards a nearby Walmart when the driver tries negotiating that he'd lower the price. But no matter what he said, I still ignored him, hoping he'd just go away as I knew there was no bike. I approached the Walmart and that's when the van immediately drives away, disappearing into the night. From there, I had spoken with security about the incident and that's when they had called the police. At that point, I explained where I was, what I did, and what was said. As you could imagine, the listing had been taken down, and I never saw it again. I was unable to give a good description of the van, other than the fact that it was black with windows. I had assumed the cops would tell my parents about this, but given that I was 18, the cops couldn't inform them without my consent. I had Ubered back to my house safely, with thankfully nobody following me. Till this day, I'm still unsure as to what that man's intentions were, but they obviously weren't good. I advise anyone thinking to use Craigslist to not do it, as it's not only sketchy but also dangerous. And for those of you who are gonna do it, I emphasize you please bring someone else along with you. It may just save your life. I'm a 27-year-old female, and this happened in the summer of last year. My fiance and I had just bought a house in the suburbs of Providence, Rhode Island. It's a really nice city with tons of historic sites, museums, and whatnot. My fiance and I are very into Southern history, which is one of the reasons as to why we moved there. On top of that, the annual pay for my work was double. At the time, we had stayed in an apartment in Atlanta, and we were getting rid of furniture to keep and sell. We had about a month to move all of our stuff into our new home, but we couldn't bring everything. My fiance and I had put up an ad for our dining room table up on Craigslist for $1,500. It was a really nice table, and we needed the money, so why throw it outside when we could sell it? This would be my first time selling something on Craigslist, as I would always be buying stuff instead. I've never really had any strange encounters while online, but little did I know that would all change. I'd say in an hour, I had received a message from someone who seemed interested in it. I had responded back, asking him when a good time and day he'd be available. He said that he had work during the day, but that he could possibly stop by after and pick it up. We had both agreed around 7 p.m., which was a reasonable time to do the transaction. So 7 p.m. rolls around when I hear a knock at the front door. Upon opening it, I was greeted to a tall man standing feet away from me while giving me an awkward grin. He wore a white tank top, cargo shorts, and a straw hat. His hair was a mess, and he looked as if he hadn't been to the gym in years. He then put out his hand, introducing himself as George. Being nice, I shake his hand and politely show him the dining room table. At first I thought that he was gonna take it instantly, as he seemed very interested when messaging me. However, he began inspecting what I assumed was the condition of it and would possibly try to lowball me as much as he could. He takes a decent look at it for about a couple of minutes before he gets up and says he'll do it for $1,000. I had apologized, telling him that was much too low and that the most I could do is $1,200. The very second I told him this, his weird, unsettling grin began to fade into an upset frown. When I realized he wasn't kidding, his face turned bright red, which clearly meant anger. "Look, lady, I'm trying to take this off your hands. Just give me the damn table." The smell of alcohol in his breath could be noticed as he yelled at me. At this point, I'm freaked the hell out and nervously tell him that if he didn't want the table, then he could leave. He takes a look around my apartment, turns around, and full-on kicks my door open in anger. Not wanting to take a risk, I shut my door and lock it and immediately call my fiancé. My fiancé had been at the store and rushed home as soon as he could. About 10 minutes later, my fiancé arrived where I told him everything, nearly breaking down in tears. He had recommended we report it to the police, but I told him it wasn't worth it as he was gone. Looking back, I really wished I had listened to him. The rest of the day went smoothly until around 1 a.m., when I got a Ring doorbell alert on my phone. The message had read that there was someone outside of my door. When I went to go see who it was, standing there was the same man from earlier, trying to unlock it. This story is told in the perspective of a female. This took place during the fall of 2020 when I had just graduated high school. I attended art school outside of Portland, and I just gotten a job at my local Best Buy to pay for my classes and other expenses. Unfortunately, my school wasn't close by from my apartment building, and I'd oftentimes find myself having to rely on public transportation to get me places. I mean, sometimes my friends offered me a ride if they had time, but I'd mostly end up taking the bus. After a very long and stressful 3 months of taking the public bus, I decided that I needed to get a car. Since the start of the pandemic, car prices have skyrocketed due to high demand, and I didn't have the money to afford a brand new one. I looked on multiple car websites for a decent price, but even the used ones were still too expensive. Eventually, I ended up looking through Craigslist to see if I could find a deal, and to my surprise, I actually did. On one of the ads was a used 2004 Honda Civic, which seemed to be in pretty good condition for a car that old. I gave the seller a call, and he confirmed that the car was in perfect condition and there was no accident history. What struck me the most was this guy's accent. Based on his accent, he didn't sound like he was from the States. He sounded Japanese. Thankfully, he had lived in the same city as I was in, and I told him that I'd go over to his house to check out the car after I got off work. I'd also like to note that I had been aware of scams on Craigslist, but based on the reviews, this guy seemed like a trusted seller. After my shift had ended, my friend drives me and we go to the given address that he provided. The house happened to be in the quiet side of town, which wasn't the best area to be in. It wasn't dangerous or anything, but you'd have rundown homes and shady people, and sirens would often be heard a few times a week. You get the picture. Anyway, my friend Sean and I pull up to a house at the far end of the street, and I looked at the address to confirm it was the right house. As I'm walking to the front door, I look to my left, and sure enough, there was the Honda Civic sitting by the garage. I casually walk up to the door and text the seller that I was here while my friend stays behind waiting for me. He then tells me to wait outside and that I could check out the car if I wanted to and that he'll be out soon. At first, I thought this was a little strange, but I didn't think I was in danger or anything. I walk over to the car, and as soon as I get a better look at it, I realized that it wasn't what it showed in the pictures. It was the same car, but I began to notice several problems with it. The front end cover was salvaged, a wheel was missing, and both the taillights had been shattered. At this point, I was furious and annoyed that I wasted my time coming here. I texted the seller saying that I was leaving and that I wasn't interested anymore. This is when shit really starts to get crazy. As I'm backing away from the car, someone from under comes out and throws me to the ground. I'm a 5-foot girl that weighs about 100 pounds, and the guy pinning me down was huge. All the while, I was screaming at the top of my lungs while kicking and doing everything I could to get him off. Thankfully, Sean comes running out of his car and pushes the man off of me and tells me to run. Surprisingly, he had managed to throw a few good punches to the man's head, and we both get in the car and drive off. As we were leaving, I could see at least 5 or 6 people running out of the house trying to chase us, but gave up after a few seconds. Once we felt like we had gotten far enough, I called the police while crying my eyes out and explained what had happened. I gave them the address and they ended up investigating the house, but had found no one inside. Turns out, that house had been vacant for years and nobody was supposed to be living there at the time. Till this day, I still don't know what their intentions were. I don't know if they were going to rob us, try and kidnap me, or something much worse. What I do know is that I will never be using Craigslist again for anything. However, let my story be a lesson for you. If something seems too good to be true, it probably is.